When their newborn suddenly goes quiet after choking in the freezing terraced fields, and Quang is held back and told, "Finish the row first," every second becomes a fight to keep his baby breathing. Hello, everyone. I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today, we'll step into Linda and Quang's hardest morning in the mountain village, where a little rain, a little pride, and one tiny breath could change everything. If you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next videos. The terraced field was cold enough to sting. Linda stood on the narrow ridge with the baby pressed to her chest in a worn sling, and her whole body went still. A small choking sound came from the baby, one wet cough, then nothing. No cry, no fuss, just a sudden wrong quiet. "Quang!" she called, not loud but sharp. He was one terrace over, ankle-deep in mud, lifting 2 buckets onto a wooden yoke. A man beside him raised a hand. "Finish the row," he said, like it mattered more than breath. Quang didn't argue. He set the yoke down, water splashing his calves, stepped onto the ridge, and crossed to her with careful speed. His boot slipped once. He caught himself and kept going. When he reached Linda, his breathing was steady, but his eyes weren't. He pulled the baby upright against his chest, chin tilted down. "Hey," he murmured, "I've got you." His palm patted between the shoulder blades, firm, gentle. The baby's mouth opened. A thin bubble of milk appeared. Quang kept the baby upright and rubbed the back in slow circles. Linda held her breath. The quiet stretched for a beat too long. Then the baby sputtered, coughed, and let out a thin, offended wail that snapped the morning open. Linda's knees softened. She pressed a hand to her mouth to keep her own sound small. Quang held their child close, cheek to damp hair, and breathed out through his nose. "That's good," he whispered. "You're okay." 2 women nearby had paused. Their faces were blunt from weather and work. One clicked her tongue. "Newborns don't belong out here," she said. "Cold wind like this. You invite sickness." Quang nodded once, accepting the warning without feeding it. "We'll be careful," he said. He eased the baby back into the sling, adjusting the fabric so the chin stayed clear. Tug, smooth, check. Then he pulled Linda's scarf higher, blocking the wind from the baby's face. "Are you dizzy?" he asked, so softly the others wouldn't hear. Linda wanted to say no, but the world tilted when she shifted her weight. A deep ache flared low in her belly, the honest reminder of how recent the birth was. "A little," she admitted. Quang's hand found her elbow. "Sit," he said. "There's work," Linda whispered, glancing at the long, wet lines of the field. "There's you," Quang answered, "and there's him." They found a patch of drier ground near a stack of straw. Quang spread a handful flat and guided Linda down. She sat carefully, keeping the sling steady. The baby hiccuped, then settled, warm against her. "I'm sorry," Linda said. "For calling me?" Quang asked. "For bringing him out here?" she whispered. Quang shook his head. "We need rice," he said. "Half a morning, then we go home." An older woman stepped over, headscarf tight, eyes sharp. She held out a knob of ginger and a small bundle of dried leaves. "Boil this," she said. "Steam him near the pot, not too close." Linda took it. "Thank you." The woman's gaze lingered on them like she was measuring. "Keep your heads down," she muttered, then turned away. Quang leaned close to Linda. "We do the work," he said. "We go home." He lifted the yoke again. "Stay here. If he coughs, sit him up, just like we did." Linda nodded, voice thin. "Okay." Quang paused, then touched the sling knot, checking it one more time. "Look at me," he said. Linda met his eyes. "You didn't freeze," he told her. "You protected him." It was a simple sentence, and it steadied her more than comfort ever could. She nodded again. Okay. The morning moved in small pieces. Linda worked from where she sat, hands busy with what she could manage, sorting seedlings, stripping dead leaves, tying bundles with thin grass. When the baby fussed, she rocked by inches and hummed under her breath. When the wind shifted, Quang crossed the ridge and pulled her scarf higher over the sling without a word. People looked. A younger man laughed with his friend, eyes sliding toward Linda like she was a story. Quang kept his face blank and his hands moving. By late morning, clouds dropped lower. A cold dot of rain landed on Linda's wrist. Quang saw it and finished the last stretch with steady urgency. The foreman, cigarette stuck to his lip, handed Quang a small bag of rice and 2 sweet potatoes. His gaze slid to the sling. "That's all," he said. Quang bowed his head. "Thank you," he said and took it. Linda understood. Pride didn't warm a baby. They started home before the rain thickened. The path down the terraces was slick. Quang walked on the outer edge, body angled so he could catch Linda if she slipped. Linda held the sling with one hand and his sleeve with the other. Their fingers brushed, then stayed together. Halfway down, the baby sighed and settled deeper into sleep. Linda felt that tiny weight against her chest and let her own breathing smooth. At the cottage, Quang pushed the door open with his shoulder. The room smelled of stone and old smoke. He set the rice on the table like it mattered, then went straight to the hearth. Kindling, match, breath, he coaxed a flame into being. Linda sat on the low stool by the fire and loosened the sling. Quang filled a pot, dropped in the ginger and leaves, and covered it. As the first steam rose, he pulled a blanket around Linda's shoulders and tucked it under her chin. "Too much for one morning," he said quietly. Not blame, just care. Linda watched the steam curl into the cold room. "I hate feeling useless," she admitted. Quang crouched beside her, close enough that his knee touched hers. "You're not useless," he said. "You kept him warm. You called me." His hand rested on her knee, warm through the blanket. "That's the day." The baby stirred, then settled again, tiny fingers opening and closing against Linda's shirt. Quang offered one finger and the baby held it without knowing why. Outside, rain began to tap the roof in a steady rhythm. Inside, the fire cracked gently. Quang stayed beside Linda, one hand still offered to their child, the other holding Linda in place until the room felt warm enough to breathe. Steam gathered under the pot lid and softened the sharp smell of wet stone. Quang kept the flame low, watching the water like it was something he could control. Linda sat on the stool with the baby tucked against her chest. The sling loosened just enough to let him breathe freely. Outside, rain tapped the roof in a steady rhythm. Quang crossed the room and slid 2 fingers under the baby's collar. His face changed, not panic, but focus. "He's warm," he said. Linda's hand tightened around the blanket. "How warm?" "Not burning," Quang answered, but he held the baby upright anyway, cheek against his shoulder, listening with his whole body. The baby gave a small, sleepy grunt. Quang rubbed the tiny back in slow circles until the breathing sounded clean again. "We don't gamble tonight," Quang said. He went to the table and counted what they had. A small bag of rice, 2 potatoes, a pinch of salt. Then his hand came out of his pocket with a thin, worn ring. He turned it once between thumb and forefinger. Linda's eyes found it. "No," Quang looked at her. "It's a thing," he said. "He's a person." "It's yours," Linda replied, voice low. "It matters." Quang closed his fist around the ring, as if putting away a part of himself. "I'll go down the path," he said. "I'll be quick." "In this rain?" Linda asked. "If he gets hotter, we'll be too late," Quang said. And that was the only fear he allowed into his voice. Linda swallowed. "Tell me what to do." Quang adjusted the sling knot, tugging it tight, then loosening a hair. "Keep him upright if he coughs," he said. "Steam him near the pot, not close. And if you feel dizzy, you sit down. You don't prove anything." Linda nodded. "And if someone comes?" "Say little," Quang said. "You keep him breathing." He leaned over the baby and touched the small forehead with his knuckle, then kissed the air above it. "I'm right back," he murmured, and went out into the rain. The door shut, and the room felt wider in the wrong way. Linda stayed still for one long breath, then made herself move. She shifted the baby to her shoulder, gave his back 2 gentle pats, and listened. The breathing was soft, regular. She fed him when he rooted, rocking by inches while the pot steamed beside her. When the baby fell asleep again, she rubbed his feet until they warmed and kept the blanket tucked high over his back. Her eyes kept drifting to the rice on the table, not from hunger but from math. How many bowls, how many days, how many chances to get it wrong? The leak near the door started to tick into a bowl, a small sound that made the room feel more alone. When the latch finally lifted, Linda exhaled like she'd been holding herself together with breath alone. Quang stepped inside, soaked through, mud on his boots, water dripping off his sleeves. In one hand, he carried a small paper packet. In the other, a tiny sachet of salt. His pocket looked lighter. "Medicine," he said. Her throat tightened. "You traded it." Quang gave a brief nod and moved straight to the fire. He warmed his hands for a second, then tore the packet carefully. Inside were 2 tablets. "How is he?" Quang asked. "Still warm," Linda said. "Not worse." Quang poured a little warm water into a spoon, crushed a small portion of a tablet with the back of it, and stirred until it clouded. Every movement was slow and deliberate. His wet sleeve brushed Linda's wrist, and she caught the fabric lightly, grounding herself in the fact that he was back in the room. Linda supported the baby's head. Quang slid the spoon to the corner of the mouth, tipped a few drops in. The baby grimaced, then swallowed. Quang waited, watched, then gave another small sip. When it was done, he kept the baby upright against his chest and rubbed his back until the baby's eyelids drooped. "That's good," Quang whispered. He sank to the floor beside Linda's stool, shoulder resting lightly against her shin. The contact was quiet, but it held them in the same place. For a while, they listened to the rain and the soft crack of the fire. "I ran into the foreman," Quang said after a moment. Linda's stomach tightened. "What did he want?" "Questions," Quang replied. "Where we stay? How long?" He looked at the door. "People notice what's new." Linda stared at the baby's sleeping face. "I don't want attention." "We won't invite it," Quang said. He reached up and took her hand, pressing her fingers to his cheek for a beat. "We do the next right thing, that's all." Linda's eyes filled. "I hate that you had to trade it." "I hated it," Quang said, "but I won't let you carry it." He guided her hand down and placed it on the baby's back. "Feel him. That's what matters." The baby's breathing was steady now, chest rising in tiny waves. Linda watched the rhythm until her own breathing slowed. Quang stayed close, eyes on their child as if attention could be a shield. The rain eased to a thin drizzle. Quang stood and made small fixes without comment. A bowl under the leak, the rice bag moved higher, a final piece of wood added to the fire. Then he came back to Linda. "Lie down," he said. Linda started to argue out of reflex, but Quang's look stopped her. Tired, steady, not asking. She eased onto the thin mattress. Quang laid the baby between them, swaddled and warm. He lay on the outside, closer to the cold wall, his arm curved around them without pressing, just making space safer. In the dim light, Linda reached for his hand. "Thank you," she whispered. Quang's fingers closed around hers. "Stay with me," he said. "I am," Linda answered. The baby made a small sigh and turned toward her warmth. Quang's thumb moved once over her knuckles, slow and sure, until Linda's eyes finally closed and the fear in her chest softened into something quieter.
Xin chào. Trong cái lạnh cắt da của vùng cao, Linda ngồi thụn một mình trên đường màu xanh, quanh quẩn với đàn gà, đàn vịt, căn nhà sàn cũ kỹ. Lòng lúc nào cũng thấy cô đơn, mặc cảm và bị cảm giác bị bỏ rơi. Đúng lúc đó, Quang trở về, lo lắng dặn cô không được đi vào những nơi vực sâu nguy hiểm và hứa sẽ bù đắp cho những thiếu thốn của cô. Vài ngày sau, Quang cùng người khiêng lên một chiếc tủ gỗ lớn, chắc chắn đặt giữa căn nhà sàn, giúp Linda lần đầu được treo gọn quần áo, chăn màn như một người thực sự có nhà. Anh xin nghỉ làm ở lại chăm sóc, cùng nấu ăn với cô, chế củi, trò chuyện mỗi tối. Chiếc tủ mới dần trở thành biểu tượng cho tương lai vững chắc và sợi dây gắn kết âm thầm giữa hai người. Mọi người hãy like, share và subscribe để ủng hộ giúp mình nhé.